Longtime listeners to National Public Radio and PRI's The World will recognize the name of former science correspondent and editor David Barron. He has written and reported on every conceivable and previously inconceivable topic related to the sciences, from triaging donated livers to planetary classification to climate change. He is also the author of The Beast in the Garden, which tells the harrowing story of the clash between suburban sprawl and mountain lions in Colorado. The book was variously described as an elegant work of narrative journalism and a compelling, tightly written account of what happens when two highly evolved predators, man and mountain lion, attempt to share the same space. The recipient of numerous awards from organizations including the National Academy of Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Barron's new book, American Eclipse, details the 19th century celestial and terrestrial drama of a coast-to-coast total solar eclipse, in which three distinctly American personalities, including a ruthless young Thomas Edison and Mariah Mitchell, a Vassar professor of astronomy and computer, jockey for discovery amidst the last days of the Wild West. Our friend Maureen Corrigan writes, while the total eclipse of 1878 lasted about 3 minutes, Barron's suspenseful narrative history makes those 3 minutes seem transcendent. Please welcome David Barron.
Book, and I actually want to truly start with a question to all of you, which is, who among you already has plans for August 21st of this year? All right, a good number of you, although I wish all the hands went up, because I've, as you should know, and you now will know, on August 21st of this year, a total solar eclipse will cross the United States from coast to coast for the first time in 99 years. It is going to be a very big deal. And I have had plans for what I would be doing on August 21st of 2017 for 19 years. In fact, that's how long I've been planning my book. So it's really kind of surreal to see this as an actual book after 19 years. But the story of how I came to write the book goes back a little bit farther than that. So that's what I want to tell you before I get started. And let's just go to a blank screen. So in 1994, I was working as a science correspondent for NPR, and a solar eclipse, a partial solar eclipse, was set to cross the country. And so I did a story about this, and I interviewed an astronomer who told me what was going to happen and how to view it. But he emphasized to me that, there's a tremendous difference between a partial solar eclipse and a much rarer total solar eclipse. During a total solar eclipse, the moon completely blocks the face of the sun for all of a couple of minutes, but it produces, as this astronomer Jay Pasakoff told me, the most awe-inspiring sight in all of nature. And so in the course of this interview, the astronomer told me this, and I remember it clearly to this day. He said to me, before you die, you owe it to yourself to experience a total solar eclipse. Well, that was pretty strong language, and it got me thinking, so I did some research. And now, if you wait for a total solar eclipse to come to you, I discovered you're going to be waiting a long time. Any given point on Earth experiences a total solar eclipse about once every 400 years. But if you're willing to travel, you don't have to wait that long. And I found that a few years later, in 1998, a total solar eclipse was going to cross the Caribbean. Now, a total eclipse can be seen only in a narrow band. It's called the path of totality. And that's where the moon's shadow falls. And in February of 1998, the path of totality was set to cross Aruba. So I figured going to Aruba in February sounded like a good idea anyway. So I went to Aruba to see what would happen when the sun briefly went away. So February 26th found me and many other people out on the beach behind the Hyatt Regency waiting for the show to begin. And we were wearing eclipse glasses, like I believe you guys were given. And those enable you to look at the sun safely, because during a partial eclipse, you can harm your eyes if you don't have protection. And a total eclipse begins as a partial eclipse. So the moon slowly made its way in front of the sun. And it first looked like the sun had a little notch taken out of its edge, and then that notch grew larger and larger. And soon the sun became a crescent. And it was all very interesting, but honestly, the day was still bright. If I hadn't known what was happening overhead, I wouldn't have noticed anything. Well, about 10 minutes before the total eclipse was set to begin, weird things started to happen. So first, here I am on this tropical beach, and a cool wind starts to blow. And then I noticed that the quality of daylight has shifted. The colors look different, and shadows look very strange. Shadows have grown really sharp, as if someone had turned up the contrast knob on TV. And then I look offshore, and I can see running lights on boats. So obviously it's getting dark, even though I hadn't realized it. Well, then it was clear it was getting dark. It was like my eyesight was going. And all of a sudden, the lights go out. Well, at that, a cheer erupts from the beach, and we take off our eclipse glasses, because at this point, and only this point, during the total phase of a total eclipse, it is safe to look at the sun with the naked eye. And so I look up in the sky, and I'm just dumbfounded. Because here I am, at this point in my mid-30s, having lived on Earth long enough to know what the sky looks like. I mean, I've seen blue skies, and I've seen gray skies, and starry skies, and angry skies, and pink skies at sunrise. But here was a sky I had never seen. So first there were the colors. Overhead it was a deep purple gray, like twilight. But on the horizon it was orange, like sunset, 360 degrees. And up ahead, up above, in the twilight, bright stars and planets had come out. So I could see Jupiter, and I could see Mercury, and there was Venus, and the planets were all in a line. And sitting there among them was this thing, this glorious, bewildering thing that it looked like a wreath woven from silvery thread, and it just hung there in space, shimmering. Now that was the sun's outer atmosphere, the solar corona, and pictures just don't do it justice. It's not just a ring or a halo around the sun. It's beautifully textured, like it's made out of strands of silk. And it looked nothing like the sun, but I knew that was the sun, so I was seeing the sun and the planets together. I was looking toward the center of the solar system. It was as if I had left our solar system and was looking back. And for the first time in my life, I just felt viscerally connected to the universe in all of its immensity. And I stood there in what I can only describe as a kind of nirvana for 174 seconds, less than 3 minutes, because at that point, it was over. The sun came back out, the blue sky returned, the stars and the planets and the corona were gone, and the world returned to normal, but I had been permanently changed. And so that is how I became an eclipse chaser. And that's why now I spend my time and hard-earned money every couple of years heading off to some far corner of the earth, to wherever the moon's shadow is going to fall, to re-experience that. But on that beach in Aruba in 1998, as a science writer, I decided I was going to write a book about eclipse chasing. But I knew in 1998 that the time when people would actually care, at least in America, was in the summer of 2017, because this is when we'll be having our own amazing eclipse, and millions of people will see it, and people will want to know about eclipses. So again, that was 19 years ago, but it was about 6 years ago that I really got serious, and I thought, well, if I'm going to write this book, and it's going to come out in 2017, I better figure out what it is. So I looked around for a good eclipse story to tell, something worthy of a book. And I live out in Colorado now, and it so happens that the story I found was set out in the American West. So, whoops, I have to turn this on. There we go. The West is, of course, a landscape filled with history and with legends, the gunfight at the OK Corral, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. It's sometimes difficult to distinguish where fact ends and fiction begins. Well, 6 years ago, I came across a particularly puzzling tale from the Old West. I live in Colorado, but north of there, if you go up to Wyoming and drive across the Laramie Plains and then go over the snowy range of the Medicine Bow Mountains, you'll soon find yourself in the Sierra Madres, and that's where you'll find a place called Battle Lake. And here, on the shoulder of State Highway 70, you'll see a historical marker. And this is what it says. Thomas A. Edison camped near this spot in 1878 while on a fishing trip. It was here that his attention was directed to the fiber from his bamboo fishing pole, which he tested as a suitable filament for his incandescent electric lamp. Well, the claim, put more plainly elsewhere, is that it was here in Wyoming that Edison, in a flash of inspiration, devised his light bulb. Well, this I thought was pretty intriguing, and I wanted to know, is that true? Well, what better place to look than True West magazine? And indeed, in the 1960s, they ran an article about this. It is a fact that Edison came to Wyoming in 1878. Just before he invented the light bulb. He did go fishing at Battle Lake. And what brought him to Wyoming? Well, he was in the West with a bunch of astronomers, and they had come to observe a total solar eclipse. Thomas Edison is second from the right over there. And so I decided to look into this, to delve into the archives, to go back in time, to learn why Edison came for the eclipse. Who were his companions? Why was the eclipse so important? And what lasting impact did it have? Now, let me say right off the bat that the light bulb story is a legend. Edison did not invent the incandescent lamp in Wyoming. But the true story is no less compelling. As I discovered, and as I write in my book, Edison and others who came west in 1878 did change America in some profound ways, and the eclipse was the catalyst. So let me tell you the true story of the scientist who raced to the American frontier for the total solar eclipse of 1878. So first, some context. In 1878, the general outlines of modern America were already in place. Our national borders looked like they do today. The Civil War was over. The nation had 38 states. The most recent addition was Colorado. We were a vibrant, can-do nation, population 50 million and growing fast. We were building big cities, and we were spreading west. The mindset, the rallying cry was manifest destiny. The Transcontinental Railroad had recently been completed, opening new territory to settlement and sparking clashes between the pioneers and Native Americans. We were a rapidly developing adolescent nation. We had just celebrated our 100th birthday, of course, with a celebration here in Philadelphia. And we were, you might say, intellectually immature. Europe was the clear center of Western culture, the place where respectable literature and art and music came from. And Europe led the world in science. In fact, you might say, Europe led the world in chasing eclipses. Now, an eclipse, a solar eclipse occurs, of course, when the moon passes between the sun and the earth, and therefore the moon casts its shadow on the earth. The moon's shadow actually has two different parts, and if I kind of zoom in on what this looks like, there's an outer portion of the shadow, and that's what's marked here in the dashed line. That's called the penumbra, and that's a zone of partial shadow. So anyone in this large area gets to see a partial solar eclipse. This inner darker zone, that's called the umbra, and it's only there in that dark circle that you will see a total solar eclipse. But all of this is in motion, of course. The moon is moving, the earth is turning, and so actually what happens is that the umbra traces a line across the earth, and that is the path of totality for this particular eclipse. Anyone in that path will have the eclipse pass over them. Now, total eclipses occur somewhere on Earth about once every 18 months. And if you then look at the tracks that they make over time, they trace out these lines sort of like spaghetti thrown on a map. So this is a map showing the paths of totality of eclipses from 1842 to 1893. Now, this is a particularly interesting period. In fact, the mid to late 1800s has been referred to as the golden age of eclipse expeditions, because this was a time when total solar eclipses were not just interesting natural spectacles to look at, they were actually very important to science. Astronomers were just starting to unravel the mysteries of the sun. What is this great ball of fire at the center of our solar system? What is it made of? What fuels it? And there were certain studies of the sun that could only be done during those brief few minutes of a total solar eclipse. During a total eclipse, the moon, shown as this big black circle here, blocks the bright surface of the sun, which enables scientists to look at what's around the sun. These red things called prominences that stick off like flames, and the ethereal corona. So whenever a total eclipse was predicted, such as this one over India in 1871, astronomers took their telescopes and spectroscopes and other equipment and headed off to sit in the path of totality. They'd hope that clouds didn't show up, and they'd frantically conduct their observations in those 2 or 3 minutes of midday darkness. And this is a British team in India in 1871. Well, the United States did launch eclipse expeditions too, but the Europeans were the clear leaders, until, that is, 1878, when the moon's shadow was set to visit our own backyard. The date was July 29, 1878, and the path of totality ran right down the American frontier, from Montana Territory down to Texas. So here was America's chance to shine, or an opportunity to slip up and embarrass ourselves, but if all went well, we would show the rest of the world what we were capable of as a scientific nation. And so the eclipse was a big national undertaking. The US government issued official instructions for observing the eclipse, how to view it safely, and how to collect information that could help astronomers as well. The solar corona, which, as I mentioned to you, we know today is the sun's outer atmosphere, back then it was a tremendous mystery. And so just characterizing its shape and size was really important for scientists. So in an early form of crowdsourcing, federal scientists asked people who were artistically inclined to sketch the corona and submit their artwork to Washington. So the instructions included a template you could use, and then an example of what a good drawing would look like, showing the contours of the inner and outer corona. Meanwhile, the government encouraged professional astronomers to go west for the eclipse. It offered logistical advice on railroad travel for those going privately, and the U.S. Naval Observatory put out the call for scientist volunteers to participate in a half-dozen government expeditions as well. And the responses to these invitations came back like RSVPs to a wedding invitation. Here's the Cincinnati Observatory. You can see they've noted up top that they've accepted the invitation. The Morrison Observatory accepts. Yale College accepts. Harvard sends its regrets. So the government assembled its scientific parties and dispatched them to the frontier to meet the moon's shadow. This is a U.S. Naval Observatory team in Colorado, and you can see they've set up their telescopes on the roof of a hotel in a gold mining town in Colorado. Also in the path of totality was Denver, and that's where a team from Princeton camped out for a month waiting for the eclipse. To the north of Colorado, in Wyoming, this camp was established by the U.S. Naval Observatory right beside the Transcontinental Railroad, and you can see these temporary structures they've set up. Here's their little observatory with a canvas roof and the telescope sticking out. And also in Wyoming, of course, was this group. So let me talk just a little bit about this extraordinary collection of talent that gathered in the rough and tumble railroad town of Rawlins, Wyoming. And I'll mention just a few of these individuals. Actually, I should mention another one. I don't have an extra slide for him with me, but this guy on the left, that's George Barker. He was a physicist at the University of Pennsylvania and a good friend of Thomas Edison's. But I'm mostly going to focus here on the right and zoom in there. So as I said, this fellow here, that's Thomas Edison, and I'll talk about him in a minute. Over here on the right, the far right, that is Norman Lockyer. Now, Norman Lockyer was a British astronomer who was particularly famous, and is today as well. He's the man who first discovered the element helium, which actually he found in the sun long before it was ever discovered on Earth. He also was a highly, highly influential man because he was the founding editor of the British scientific journal Nature. Over here on the left, beside his wife Annette, this large fellow here is James Craig Watson. Now, Watson was a professor of astronomy at the University of Michigan. This was his domain, the paradoxically named Detroit Observatory, which is in Ann Arbor. And Watson was known as a planet hunter. Now, if you were to look at a solar system diagram from that era, like this one from 1846, you'll notice that the planets look somewhat different from the way they do today. So first, if we zoom in on the region between Mars and Jupiter, you'll see it goes Mars, Vesta, Juno, Ceres, Pallas, Jupiter. Well, this is the asteroid belt, and those are asteroids. But back in that era, asteroids were considered planets. They were called minor planets, but they were given names just like the major planets, and finding them was a big deal. Well, James Craig Watson had a knack for discovering asteroids, and he was one of the top planet hunters in the world. Now, if we zoom in even closer to the sun, you'll see something even more puzzling. Between Mercury and the sun, there's another planet, Vulcan. Well, Vulcan was a hypothetical planet. Astronomers believed that it existed. In fact, they believed it had to exist because Mercury's orbit didn't make sense otherwise. Mercury behaved in a strange way, and the only way that astronomers could explain it was to say that there must be some mass between Mercury and the sun, and that's Vulcan, which is tugging on Mercury and disturbing its orbit. Now, no one had ever reliably seen Vulcan, but that's not a surprise. It's so close to the sun, it'll never be up in the sky at night, and in the daytime you can't see it because it's lost in the sun's glare. About the only time you might catch a glimpse of Vulcan would be during those 2 or 3 minutes of midday darkness during a total solar eclipse. So that's what James Craig Watson was out to look for. He came to Wyoming to look for Vulcan. Now, as for Thomas Edison, he was just 31 years old at the time, but he was already a global celebrity due to a recent invention, and that was the phonograph. This simple contraption with a hand crank and tin foil to record sound was an absolute sensation. Before Edison, no one even imagined that it would be possible to capture and release sound at will. Edison was hailed as a genius. He was called a wizard. He was the Wizard of Menlo Park because he had his laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey at that time. Well, this was a ridiculously creative and productive time for Edison. He was constantly dreaming up strange and wondrous inventions. There was the aerophone, an enormous loudspeaker that he suggested could be used in lighthouses to shout warnings at ships. There was the phonomotor, which used the power of the human voice to turn a wheel. And there was this thing, the Tisza Meter. Now, the Tisza Meter was an extremely sensitive heat detector, basically an electric thermometer that Edison claimed could measure changes in temperature as small as 1/1,000,000th of a degree Fahrenheit. Today, we would call the Tisza Meter an infrared detector. Now, it was actually astronomers who had encouraged Edison to build the Tisza Meter for their work, and several of them wanted to take a Tisza Meter out west for the eclipse in 1878. In the end, Edison decided to do that himself. What he was going to do was point the Tisza Meter at the corona during the eclipse and to see if that mysterious halo gave off heat as well as light. And this was Edison's chance to show that he wasn't just some lowly inventor in his laboratory, he was a real scientist. And he went west with a bunch of academics. But even though he wanted to show himself to be a serious scientist, this was not the most serious of locations. This was the Wild West, after all. And Edison ended up attaching his Tisza Meter to a telescope in this structure back here. I'll zoom in on that. You can see this is Edison's telescope in the back, poking out of what looks like an outhouse. It's actually a hen house that Edison retrofitted as his observatory. Now, there were dozens of notable scientists who came west to view the eclipse. And in my book, I write about many of them. But the main characters I focus on are Edison, Watson, the planet hunter, and a third scientist who traveled to the frontier with very different intent. And that was Mariah Mitchell. She was by far the best-known female scientist in America in the 19th century. She first came to prominence in 1847 when she, as an astronomer, discovered a comet and earned for that a gold medal from the King of Denmark. By 1878, though, she was teaching at Vassar, the pioneering all-women's college. Well, no surprise, Mitchell was a staunch advocate for women in science and women's higher education. And this was a time when women's colleges were under attack. Because you see, in 1873, a sensational best-selling book came out. They claimed that college education could ruin a girl's health. It was written by a Harvard doctor, Edward H. Clarke, who argued that by taxing the brain, education sapped energy from a girl's maturing body, including her reproductive organs. And therefore, he said, higher learning could turn female college students into sterile, masculine invalids. And I'm not kidding. Education, he wrote, could result in a, quote, dropping out of maternal instincts and an appearance of Amazonian coarseness and force. Such persons are analogous to the sexless class of termites. Well, Mitchell believed that this was ridiculous. She encouraged young women to use their brains in her astronomy courses at Vassar. But that wasn't enough. She needed to convince American society that Dr. Clarke's book was rubbish. So in 1878, she did something remarkable. As groups of men were assembling eclipse expeditions to Wyoming and Colorado, she assembled an all-female expedition. And so this is the Vassar College Eclipse Party in Denver in 1878. This is Mariah Mitchell here. She was 65 at the time. So this wasn't just a scientific endeavor, it was, in essence, a kind of political theater to demonstrate to a skeptical public that women could be smart, educated, healthy, and feminine to boot. So these three main characters of mine had a lot on the line. Edison was out to prove the value of his Tisza Meter and to prove himself a serious scientist. Watson was out to find Vulcan and the glory that would come with discovering the planet. And Mitchell was out to change minds about the role of women in science and higher education. So in this and other ways, the eclipse was a kind of competition, and the public followed closely the various players and what they were out to achieve. This country that was not known for embracing science suddenly cared about astronomy. Well, newspapers met the demand for information by providing extensive coverage. This is the Chicago Tribune from a week before the eclipse. You can see they've got a map with the path of totality. They have a star chart showing what you might see in the heavens during the total eclipse. They show what the partial eclipse will look like in Chicago, because Chicago would not get a total eclipse. They also provided information on what the scientists would be doing. And although Chicago was outside the path of totality, people there and elsewhere were keen to get a front row seat. So there were advertisements for eclipse tours. Just like today, the public headed to the path of totality. And the destination for most eclipse tourists was Denver. The city was overrun with visitors. The hotels ran out of rooms, so guests were left to sleep on cots in hotel parlors and dining rooms, and one gentleman reportedly ended up sleeping on a billiard table. The public procured eclipse glasses. Now, there were no mass-produced glasses like you were handed with Mylar lenses, but instead, newsboys took shards of glass and smoked them over flames, or they collected pieces of colored glass. This guy here is holding a piece of blue glass. And they sold them on street corners. Here's your colored glass for seeing the eclipse, the newsboys cried. And mind you, this is verbatim from an 1878 article. Genuine French imported Mazarine blue, London smoke and bottle green, 3 kinds, 3 cents each or 2 for $5. Well, I have to say, immersing myself in this history was tremendous fun. Reading old newspapers and scientific reports cast me back in time, and I enjoyed tracking down what remains from that era as I retraced my character's footsteps. So I went to Vassar to see the observatory that Mariah Mitchell used to preside over, and that she still does, although now as a bronze bust. I visited Edison's Menlo Park Laboratory, which was reconstructed in Michigan by Henry Ford, and that's where I found a Tisza Meter. Also in Michigan, I went to James Craig Watson's Detroit Observatory in Ann Arbor, and nearby in Ypsilanti, I found the telescope that Watson took to Wyoming to look for Vulcan. So this telescope there is this one front and center in 1878. I also went up to Rawlins, Wyoming to find the spot where that photo was taken. It was a little bit of a disappointment. It's a parking lot at the post office. But most of my research was done in Washington at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives, because it's here that a lot of the original documents have been stored. Crumbling envelopes and files filled with letters and telegrams and scientific reports. And remember, I told you that the government was interested in artwork of the eclipse. Well, the general public and scientists submitted their drawings and paintings of the corona, from simple pencil sketches like this one, which was actually drawn by Wyoming's territorial governor who was on hand that day. Other depictions were more elaborate. I just love this watercolor and this pastel. And this was the view from 14,000 feet up on top of Pikes Peak, Colorado, where a particularly hardy group of scientists battled snowstorms in July and serious altitude sickness to get just an amazing view of the heavens. Anyway, as you can tell, on Eclipse Day, many people enjoyed an amazing view of the eclipse. And it was a proud and exciting day for my three main characters as well. Now, I don't want to spoil the story by giving everything away, but Edison and the test of his Tisza Meter, Mariah Mitchell in her quest to change public attitudes, even Watson in his quest for Vulcan, all three of my main characters were quite pleased with how the day turned out. And the headlines after the eclipse were effusive. "Great results," announced a Chicago paper. "The most important observations ever made," said the New York Herald. It was a banner day for these scientists, and it was for America too. The eclipse that crossed the frontier enabled this young country to prove to the world that it could do science. It could take on Europe. As one local boasted to a visitor from England, "Sir, Colorado can beat the world in eclipses as in everything else." Well, the Rocky Mountain eclipse helped boost America's interest in science and bolstered its confidence in that realm. Now, admittedly, the specific achievements of my characters did not quite pan out. Mariah Mitchell did help open the doors of science to women, but it's not like her male counterpart suddenly embraced female scientists. It was the beginning of a long, hard, continuing struggle. Did Watson really discover Vulcan? You might be able to guess, but I'll leave you to read and find out. As for Edison's Tisza Meter, it never did live up to its hype, and Edison quickly turned to other projects. In fact, the day after Edison returned from Wyoming, he started work on a new invention. Now, there are some connections between the eclipse and the light bulb. The scientists that Edison spent time with in the West encouraged him to take up the challenge of electric light and power. And the time away from the laboratory left him refreshed to take on new projects. But did Edison dream up the light bulb on the shores of Battle Lake? No. The eclipse of 1878 did not illuminate America in the way the historical marker claims. However, it did enlighten America, helping to push this upstart nation toward what it soon would become, the undeniable global superpower in science, a country that would, in this intellectual realm, eclipse the world. And so, here is the path of the eclipse of 1878, and here is the path of the eclipse of 2017. And so let me finish my remarks by talking a little bit about what's going to happen 2 months from now. Once again, the moon's shadow, I think, will visit us at an interesting time in our nation's intellectual development. Today, the issue isn't whether America can rise up and take on Europe in science. Frankly, the issue is whether America can maintain its global lead. Our nation's impending decline in science isn't exactly a new concern. This Time magazine article comes from 2006. But if anything, the worry has grown. Just 2 months ago, thousands filled the streets in the March for Science. Many fear that an anti-science sentiment is on the rise. Activists are trying to remind the general public that well-funded research is a societal good. It makes us all stronger. And of course, there's a continuing push among educators to teach our kids science and math, to prepare them for the jobs of the future, and to bolster America's high-tech economy. So just now, when many people believe that science could use a boost, along comes our old friend, the shadow of the moon. So this is what's going to happen on August 21st. The moon's shadow will come in from the west and will strike a point just north of Newport, Oregon at 10:15 in the morning Pacific time. It'll be heading east at about 1,500 miles an hour across Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, Nebraska, a little bit of Kansas, Missouri, southern Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, a little bit of Georgia, and then the Carolinas, and it will exit the country at 2:49 p.m. Eastern Time, right near Charleston, South Carolina. Well, that wonderful animation was made by the folks at NASA, and just as the U.S. government 139 years ago took responsibility for educating the public about the coming eclipse, you'll remember the Naval Observatory issued instructions. Today, NASA is playing that role. Of course, instead of printing and distributing pamphlets, NASA's produced a special website with videos and information on eclipse science, eye safety, and eclipse-related events, and so forth. Back in 1878, teams of scientists, like the one from Princeton, headed to the path of totality to study the solar corona. Scientists will do the same this year. This group from the University of Hawaii will be observing in Oregon and Wyoming. Back in 1878, there was a call for help from citizen scientists. There is again. One of several crowdsourcing projects is called the Eclipse Mega Movie, and rather than soliciting people to make hand drawings of the corona, they're asking people to use their smartphones and to take pictures or videos of the total eclipse, which will then be patched together into a continuous film of what the eclipsed sun looked like for the entire period that it took for the shadow to move from Oregon to South Carolina. Back in 1878, newspapers took their role seriously in educating the public. The media is starting to play that role today, and you can be sure there will be a tremendous amount of coverage leading up to August 21st. Many other organizations are helping to spread the word. The American Astronomical Society, science museums, libraries, the U.S. Postal Service, which next Tuesday will be releasing a special total solar eclipse forever stamp. And this is a really fun stamp. It's a first-of-its-kind stamp with heat-sensitive ink. If you press your thumb over the darkened moon, it lights up. Even private companies are getting involved. A St. Louis brewery is issuing a special Path of Totality pack of beer, complete with a free pair of eclipse glasses inside and information on the eclipse on the back. And actually, I just learned today that a distillery in Wyoming has just come out with special Eclipse bourbon. I don't know what makes it special, but it's all a marketing opportunity. But mark my words, the eclipse on August 21st will be huge. There is no question that it will be the most witnessed total solar eclipse in U.S. history, probably the most witnessed total eclipse in world history. Indeed, it may end up being the biggest one-day mass migration of humanity ever. If you look at how many people live in the path of totality, 12.2 million Americans. But then if you ask, well, how many people could drive there Oh, in a couple of hours. How many people are within 100 miles of the path? 47 million Americans. Well, what about, I don't know, how about 300 miles? You could do that in a long day, go see the eclipse and come back. Over a third of the U.S. population. And if you continue this exercise, there we got Philadelphia, 500 miles. Basically, almost everyone in the United States lives within 900 miles of the total eclipse. I mean, if you had a 4-day weekend and were willing to do a really long drive, you could do it. Now, not everyone's going to do this, but many people are going to. Wyoming expects as many as 350,000 out-of-state visitors. Idaho, 500,000. Oregon, 1 million. In South Carolina, the city of Columbia alone expects 1 million visitors. Some small towns expect their populations to grow tenfold in a day. They'll be overrun not just by Americans, but by tour groups from Japan, Israel, the UK, Germany. This could be a logistical nightmare. Emergency planning professionals are putting out white papers and working with communities to prepare them for the onslaught. Some have suggested, in fact, that the towns in the path of totality treat the eclipse as if it were a natural disaster. Communities need to make sure that there's plenty of water in the supermarkets and fuel at the gas stations and cash in the ATMs and porta potties strategically placed around town, and that the hospitals and the ambulance services are fully staffed to be ready for the health problems that'll crop up in any population that balloons overnight. But of course, the eclipse is a natural disaster with a huge upside. It's an extraordinary teachable moment, one that we should not squander. It is a chance to engage our kids with the wonders of the universe. And this will be true across the entire country. All of North America on August 21st will experience at least a partial solar eclipse. Here in Philadelphia, it'll max out at 80%. This is about what the sun will look like using those eclipse glasses, don't look at it with the naked eye, at 2:44 in the afternoon. And you'll be able to watch the total eclipse online. NASA is going to be doing live streaming, so will PBS Nova and some science museums, and I'm sure that the major TV networks will break in and provide coverage as well. But of course, I would urge you, if at all possible, not to settle for a partial solar eclipse overhead and totality on your screen. You really should go see it yourself. A total solar eclipse is a transcendent experience, not only because it's so unearthly, but also because it transcends age and place and time. A total solar eclipse connects us with history. Witnessing one is the same deeply human experience today that it was even 200 years ago. In 1806, the American novelist James Fenimore Cooper experienced a total solar eclipse in his hometown of Cooperstown, New York. He was 17 years old at the time. And many years later, he wrote up his memories of what, for him, was the most profound experience of his life. Indeed, it was a profound experience for his entire community. He wrote, "Women stood in the open street near me with streaming eyes and clasped hands, and sobs were audible in different directions. Even the educated and reflecting men at my side continued silent in thought. I have passed a varied and eventful life," Cooper wrote in later years. "It has been my fortune to see earth, heavens, ocean, and man in most of their aspects, but never have I beheld any spectacle which so plainly manifested the majesty of the Creator or so forcibly taught the lesson of humility to man as a total eclipse of the sun." Thank you.
I was just wondering, given that the eclipse will occur in August, is there a high likelihood of summer thunderstorms, and how will that impact the views and things like that?
Well, right. So you want to be somewhere where the skies are clear. And eclipse chasers have been looking at the climate data for this eclipse for years. And it's no surprise that, just statistically speaking, the odds of clear skies are better in the west than the east. I think in Wyoming, it's about 70-80% chance that one will see the eclipse. In South Carolina, it's more like 30 or 40%. But it's all going to depend on what happens on that day. And so generally you want to get, if for those who want to see it, you're better off going west. But if logistically that's too difficult or too expensive, go to South Carolina, go to Tennessee, keep an eye on the forecast, and if it says it's probably going to be clearer to the west of you, go west. If it's going to be clearer to the east, go east. If it's good where you are, stay put. But it's all a gamble. I mean, I've seen 5 total solar eclipses, and I've been lucky. I haven't missed any of them entirely, but one of them I went all the way to the Faroe Islands, which is way up in the North Atlantic between Iceland and the UK, and it was cloudy, but I got to see the corona for 2 seconds, and I counted myself lucky.
Yes, does the eclipse affect the Aurora Borealis at all?
Interesting question. Does an eclipse affect the Aurora Borealis? Well, you might think it would, because the sun does create the aurora, and in fact, so when you see the corona is made up of charged particles that are streaming out at very high speed, and they become what's called the solar wind, and the solar wind is what causes the aurora. However, an eclipse has no effect on it, because basically an eclipse is always happening somewhere. It's just usually in space. I mean, the moon is always out there casting its shadow somewhere. We just happen to be going through it then. But it doesn't have any effect on the corona or on the solar wind, which is what would affect the northern lights. So I've never heard of any effect on the northern lights, and I don't think there would be any.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm sure you probably already thought of this, but I'm just asking. By 1878, I'm sure they had pretty good photographic technology, and I would think they could even develop a tracking camera. So say they had to have an exposure of 10 seconds to do that, they could have tracking technology. In fact, I developed it for the Halley's Comet 1986, that little drive motor that would allow like a 30-second exposure to the comet, while the telescope or camera was slewing. So I would think they could develop that and use that to get actual images. It may not be perfect, but they could do something. I'm sure they had that, but maybe we can speak about that.
Sure, right. So photography, of course, did exist in 1878, including photography for astronomical purposes. And there are some photographs of the 1878 eclipse. They don't look like much. I mean, the corona is beautiful to see with the naked eye, but it's very difficult to photograph because it goes from extremely bright on the inside to extremely dim farther out. And our eyes can see everything from very bright to very dim, but particularly the photography back then, you would just get a small part of it, and it didn't look like much. So in my book, I do have one photograph, but it's the drawings that are frankly give a better sense of what it looked like, and I think are just more beautiful.
I might be conflating two different things, but did Sir Arthur Eddington, 14 years after Einstein's theory of relativity, use eclipse to provide some empirical validation for that in South Pacific someplace?
Yes, so actually this is, and I get into this toward the end of my book, what you're referring to actually is the end of the Vulcan story. So I'll get to that eclipse in a minute. But you'll remember what I said. Why did astronomers think that Vulcan existed? Because Mercury's orbit didn't make sense. It didn't make sense due to Newtonian mechanics. And the person who finally solved the riddle was Albert Einstein. The reason that Mercury's orbit is a puzzle is because it's because of general relativity. Being so close to this massive object, the sun, which is distorting and warping space-time, that explains why Mercury's orbit is different from what Newton had said. And it was Einstein who figured it out. And then it actually, interestingly, was at an eclipse in 1919 that Sir Arthur Eddington, a British astronomer, came up with an experiment to prove that Einstein was right. And briefly, during an eclipse, so as late as 1919, this was a critical experiment. What he did was he was able to look at stars on either side of the eclipsed sun and to see if the stars right next to where the sun appeared in the sky if the starlight had been bent by the sun in a way that Einstein predicted. And indeed, the data pretty much confirmed Einstein, and Einstein was proved right. So that was another important eclipse, and I mentioned it very briefly toward the end of my book.
Is the observations that are taking place, that naked eye and aided, viewing directly through unfiltered lenses during the totality?
Well, in 1878 and today, yes. So during a partial eclipse, even a deep partial eclipse, don't use a telescope or binoculars or your naked eye to look at the sun. But during totality, you can use all that stuff. And frankly, you don't need any of it. A naked eye, just a plain naked eye view of a total eclipse is perfect. But the last eclipse I went to, I brought along some binoculars, and it was kind of fun to look at the corona through the binoculars and really see those fine tendrils.
What do you know about how they handled it in Havana? I saw that in 1878, the path of the eclipse was totality right over Havana, which was quite certainly more advanced than Denver. I mean, you might have another book there.
That's a really interesting question. Havana was the largest city in the path of the 1878 eclipse, and I didn't do any research into what was going on there. And then the American papers never said a thing about it. So I don't know. That would be worth a second book, I suppose. Yeah.
So where do you plan to be on August 21st? And why did you select that location?
So again, I will be in Jackson, Wyoming, and I made my hotel reservations 3 years ago, and there's nothing left in Jackson. There hasn't been for a very long time. I chose Jackson because I live in Colorado. Wyoming's easy to get to. Jackson is beautiful in the Tetons, and I've got a bunch of family members coming out to join me there. And we actually have very specific plans about where to be, which is up on top of a mountain. It's a mountain, luckily, that you don't have to climb by foot. But there's a tram that goes to the top of Rendezvous Peak at the ski resort at 10,000 feet. And I want to be up there because of the research I did about the scientists on Pikes Peak. Those who were up so high in 1878 not only got a particularly spectacular view of the corona because they were looking through less atmosphere and they really could see it even better, but more importantly, they were able to look down and see the moon's shadow coming. And the view that they had from up there, they were able to look to the northwest and see this enormous shaft of darkness from outer space coming down into the atmosphere. And it was racing toward them at almost 2,000 miles an hour. And they could see the distant peaks that were still just barely in sunlight pop out of sight as the darkness came toward them at lightning speed and washed over them. And that's what I want to experience. So we're going to be up on Rendezvous Peak. We've got the tram tickets. They were put up for sale on a Wednesday back in September, and they were all sold out in 20 minutes for tram tickets for Eclipse Day. And, unless it's just the forecast is for horribly stormy skies, that's where we're going to be, and just hope for the best.
Hi. Did you do any research about pre-scientific era humans and how they came to interpret or understand the eclipse in their context?
Well, interestingly, there were a number of ancient civilizations that knew how to predict them. They didn't know what was going on, but they studied the heavens very carefully. The Chinese, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Mayans, and they figured out that eclipses return on an 18-year cycle. Any given eclipse comes back 18 years, 10 1/3 days later. In fact, the eclipse this August, in a sense, is the same eclipse that I saw in August of 1999 in Munich. And if you were to look at the path of totality, it has the same shape as the one this year. But as I said, it repeats after 18 years, 10 1/3 days, and in that third day, the Earth has turned a third of the way. So an eclipse will return, but a third of the way around the planet. So ancient civilizations didn't know what was going on, but they did consider, some of them consider them portents and so forth, but particularly if they showed up and no one knew it was coming. So court astronomers were tasked with being able to predict eclipses. They could predict the recurrence of lunar eclipses and solar eclipses, but they did not have the ability to actually map the path of a total eclipse. That came much, much later.
Hi. Shouldn't you mention the odd occurrence in geologic time that the Earth and the Moon, is a dual planet, and the size of the two is there's nothing else in our solar system like that. And in ancient days, going back to the dinosaurs, the Moon was much closer, moving much faster. And a million years from now, it'll be further out, moving slower, and we're the lucky period that will have solar eclipse.
We are very, very lucky. Whoever's around millions of years from now, there won't be total eclipses anymore. There will still be partial eclipses. But as you said, the Moon is slowly receding from the Earth, which means it's looking slightly smaller in the sky, and at some point it will be its apparent size will be too small to cover the sun entirely. And in fact, even now, so the Moon's orbit around the Earth is not circular, it's elliptical. And so sometimes the Moon is closer to us, it looks bigger, and that's when you get that, it's that supermoon, right? The supermoon, full moon. Sometimes it's farther away. And that also means that sometimes the Moon goes right in front of the sun, and you still don't get a total eclipse. You get what's called an annular eclipse at that point, because the Moon is precisely in front of the sun, but it doesn't cover it all the way, which means you have a thin rim of the solar surface that's still visible. And that is still not a total eclipse. It doesn't go dark. You can't look at it with the naked eye. You won't see the corona. It's a very interesting partial eclipse, but it's still not a total eclipse. So in the future, whoever's around millions of years from now will still get annular eclipses, but they won't get total eclipses.
I have a writer question for you. I'm sure there were a lot of things that just couldn't fit in the book. And I just wondered if you had a favorite one that you really wished you could have kept in the book but didn't make it. And if that's an unfair question, you can
No,
move
that's
on.
a great
Yeah.
question, Beth. I mean, there was... Figuring out what to leave out was really, really hard. There were so many good characters and so many great stories. I guess what I might say is there's one character who basically shows up very briefly. I don't even provide his name. But there was a young astronomer named David Peck Todd who went to see the total eclipse in Texas. At the time, he was deeply in love with Mabel Loomis. And he was courting her, and he was writing her these love letters from Texas. And she was writing in her diary about how much she loved David. I mean, I thought they were going to be important characters in my book. And I'd even thought about maybe building a book around them, because the great story of David and Mabel, and there is in fact a book about them, but not about their eclipse chasing. They did get married. David became a professor of astronomy in Amherst. Mabel, obviously, was in Amherst, Massachusetts, with him. Well, Mabel ended up getting into this torrid love affair with the brother of Emily Dickinson, who was himself married. And this was the talk of Amherst. And in fact, Mabel Loomis Todd is famous today for, she was friendly with Emily Dickinson, and she was the one who actually first published Emily Dickinson's poetry and brought her to light. The whole story of David and Mabel is just so rich and wonderful, and I figured there must be some way I can use them in the book, but they were left for a future book, so. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. I'll be signing books.